Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the space. This is episode 4 of Visionaries. The past couple of episodes are available on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcast, in both audio and video form. If you've missed the previous episodes we've had Maya Higa, who is the streamer that does conservation work and is also running Alvea Sanctuary here in Austin. Before that, we had Atrioc, the live streamer who also has an esports background, and I know we had a lot of esports questions there as well. And then our first episode was with Marcus Bromander, the co-founder of Intersloth and co-creator of Among Us. So we've had really wide various discussions on this, and if you're unfamiliar with the product, we are essentially trying to have really high-level conversations with some of the most important, high-profile people and successful people in the gaming and esports spaces. That's why it's so large of a conversation and different conversations. And today we're welcoming on James Bardolph. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with his voice and his face, the longtime commentator. Probably known best for his work in Counter-Strike, I would say, but now has sort of expanded his portfolio further and further. Recently working on the Apex broadcast the past few weeks in North Carolina. And now joining us live. I want to start with your background because, you're someone, I'm a little bit on the younger side. I'm 25. I started working in esports in 2015 or 2014, sorry. But have been watching for, since 2009, 2010. And you're one of those people that I feel like I've always seen around. You've been in the space like from it, definitely its early popularization when more people started to pay attention to it. So how did you get there and start your career in the space?
Okay, so 2009, Street Fighter came out on PC, and I was busy for the longest time playing Counter-Strike, Day of Defeat, Team Fortress 2. I think I was smashing TF2 at the time. But I quickly started playing that and saw there was a little circuit in Europe. So I started playing on the circuit. We still had an arcade called Casino Arcade on Tottenham Court Road in London. I used to go to an arcade back in the day in Victoria, for those of you who know London, there wasn't like competitive stuff going on there, but I used to go in there and play Mortal Kombat, Daytona USA, and they had some fighting game called Primal Rage where you could fight as dinosaurs. But anyway, so I started playing Street Fighter 4 in 2009. And a lot of the guys in London would go around Europe to play in tournaments. So I joined them. We would go to a tournament in Paris called Bushido Impact on almost a monthly basis. But what I noticed quickly was that we would watch all the North American streams. Ustream was a thing back in the day. They had the POW icon, which was goated. So you had fighting games. Someone Justin TV, someone Ustream. Ustream was also famous for the 24/7 Shiba Inu puppy stream. But anyway, back on topic. So at the time, we would watch the North American stream, some of which were on Justin TV, some of which were on Ustream. And because they had visibility, players were getting sponsored. People were paying for their travel to go here and there. In the UK and in Europe, people weren't really streaming most of the tournaments. So the first international tournament I went to was in 2009 was DreamHack Winter Street Fighter 4. And they flew in some big guests from North America. They flew Gutex over, who was he had a big profile in the scene already by that time. But one thing with DreamHack is that they would only broadcast the final 3 matches: losers final, winners final, grand final. Winners final, losers final, grand final. That's it. That's all they would broadcast in Dream Arena Extreme, which they'd also do like Swedish nationals for Counter-Strike, this and that. Obviously, there's lots of different things going on in there. So they would only broadcast top three matches, and that would be it. So for fighting games, the meat and potatoes not happening. The guys in Paris at best would record the matches I'm not sure if they had commentary on them at the time. I'm thinking maybe they didn't. But anyway, I saw that the guys in North America were having all these broadcasts, and we didn't have it in Europe. So players weren't getting opportunities because no one could see them. No one knew any of this stuff was happening. Capcom had a broadcast. I think I'm not sure what version of Street Fighter it was. I'm thinking maybe Super Street Fighter 4, but at some point they had a promotional event before the game came out. I think Ibuki was new to that version of Street Fighter at the time, and they had F Word and Ryan Hart play an exhibition match. They had a partnership with Paddy Power where you could bet on the match in running, which means from round to round or set to set, the odds would change and you could continue betting. So I guess if you lost your first game, the odds would be better for you to make a comeback or whatever. So that was a promotional PR event, and they asked me to broadcast it. And my fee was basically the license for Wirecast, the software to broadcast on Mac. So they paid for my license, which enabled me to then use that software and stream everywhere. So I think that was one of the first events that we did, which is very basic. I don't think, excuse me, I don't think it had any overlays or webcams, but it grew from there. I had great relationships with everybody in France. So I basically became the English broadcasting for lots of different events. Bushido Impact in Paris, World Game Cup, which was the big annual event in March at Festival de Jeux, Festival of Games in Cannes. DreamHack, I would fly over there on my own dime, get a crappy Ibis hotel. We'd have players wherever there was floor space. There'd be players sleeping there because no one had money in those times. So people would make, because DreamHack was like a big event for people to go to. So basically, I started broadcasting all this stuff. Then slowly things developed where they started to do white label stuff, like the Capcom Pro Tour began. So it ended up being white label stuff. So I did all of the Capcom Pro Tour for Street Fighter 4 in Europe. At the same time, Fnatic were doing events in London because, their HQ is here. And they did an event in Meltdown Bar, which I don't know if you know the Meltdown Bar chain. When I used to work in commercial property. So while I was doing all of this stuff, with all these dream hacks and all this traveling, I was still working I was selling offices in London full time. And I actually I had lunch with, I had dinner with the guy who until recently managed that Meltdown Bar. I kind of found that property for them, which they went on to rent. So it was all kind of, it's all very incestuous. But I went to Cannes and I spoke to him at the event, and because there was some commentary there, it wasn't amazing. But I thought, oh, maybe I've got something to contribute to this. So he referred me to Face It because they were doing one-off things. So he introduced me to Face It. I freelanced for them for a while doing the productions. When they needed a fill in the studio for Counter-Strike, they'd stick me there with Dan and we would just figure stuff out. We were there with Dan, we were there with Jackie as well, Hoss and a bunch of other people. So it was all, I guess we were all kind of helping each other out. I was learning on the job, the Counter-Strike stuff. Obviously, I've been a Counter-Strike player since forever as well. So that's more or less my background as far as esports is concerned.
When did it become something that you could go full-time doing? Like, when did you leave that commercial real estate job and basically figure out, like, yeah, I can do this and actually make money and support myself?
Yeah, this is an interesting thing because it was purely because of Face It. It was never something I was looking for in the first place. I was looking for a different job though. I'm very grateful for where I worked in commercial real estate because I didn't go to university or anything like that. With Face It, I was doing some productions for them. That was before I was full-time. So I was doing productions for them, but we were also collaborating together. They were doing a lot of stuff at Milan Games Week. They were responsible for most or all of the esports area, which kept expanding. There were a lot of things I was capable of doing. I was an important hire for the media side of the company. Whereas, you could hire like one person who could only do this. I could do a lot of things, and I'm always like hungry to learn new things. I just like learning stuff. And I'm very creative as well. So they asked me if I wanted a full-time position. And, I said, okay, if you can meet this certain level of salary, then because I need a level of security as well. Like, I have my own life going on. I can't just be like, oh, I guess this has failed. Like, I don't have anything to fall back on. So if they can meet that, then cool. It wasn't easy to do at the time for Face It, that's for sure. But they were able to do that. And I believed in the people, most importantly. For some people, it's like, oh, okay, well, I don't know, maybe stuff didn't work out for them, so they just played games all day and kind of stumbled into this. But really, for me, it was because I believed in the people who founded and ran Face It. You know, like I was very much on the same wavelength as my boss and the CEO as well. Like we understood each other pretty well and had a really good relationship.
Yeah, you're a man of many hats and always have been, and I want to dive into that in a little bit too, because I remember when I first started, uh, kind of figuring out who everybody was in the esports space, sort of searching out people on LinkedIn and Twitter, etc. Like you weren't on it, or you were not on camera as much as you are today. So I want to dive into that in a little bit, but I do want to rewind a little bit to the beginning of esports and the commercialization of things, given that you were around before it got to that point. I remember you were talking about Ustream. I remember Ustream. I remember early Justin TV, pre Twitch in 20 or before 2014. And this was a site for those kind of unfamiliar, and I've done a lot of reporting on Twitch over the years. This was a site that was better known for having illegal UFC streams than it was having video games, at least back then. And actually, the UFC actually ended up suing Justin TV as well, which it took a long time for them to fight for them allowing those streams, and obviously they had to DMCA them. But then they spun off into Twitch in 2014, and it was a gaming specific vertical. They kept Justin TV, or sorry, not 2014, 2011. My dates are all confused in my head. 2011, and they started doing specifically gaming. And I think shortly thereafter, it became really clear that the commercialization of gaming was there, that the money could be there, and it could be sort of the biggest thing that they do. And they shuttered Justin TV and focused on it. I want to ask you, what was the touchstone point, if you can remember, that you realized esports had a really high commercial upside, and it wasn't just this thing of passion that it had been in the early 2010s and the late aughts?
I think it was maybe after our initial leagues that we did, because the early leagues where we had a very small studio in London were very easy to do. And there wasn't this kind of madness that we have in the calendar these days, and it grew each time. And on a very basic level, I don't know, if you've got a tournament with $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 in prize money, you're gonna reliably get that from people with a vested interest in the space, people who make hardware for gamers, PCs, GPUs. I could go on. But after, I guess it got to a point where other organizers realized that in the CSGO space in particular, these leagues made a lot of sense. And then a bunch of other people started making leagues as well. But also, like, and it's not just that part, but I feel like there was a period once everybody was competing for space in the calendar, and it was league after league after league and so on. Every 3 months felt like a year in terms of how much things evolved. The prize money was bumping up. The events got larger and larger. Everybody wanted to, be placed as the premium product and so on. And again, every 3 months just felt completely different. Like so much has changed in that period of time. But that felt like a 3 or 4 year period where that happened. I couldn't pinpoint exactly because my sleep is terrible and therefore my memory is as well. Although post-COVID, my sleep's much better now. But this was probably, it's got to be like pre-2016, I feel like, because we were already doing really big things by that time. So maybe like 2015, 2014, 2015, somewhere around there. I mean, you could see the growth at the very early majors in CSGO specifically, and I think CSGO is definitely one of the driving forces when you look at esports as a whole. Of okay, this is getting significant, because I think in the early years, like when I joined Face It, we were just enjoying the creative juices and being able to do something that we really end up doing. And I think as it grew, I guess there's a point where you realize that your hobby is your job.
Yeah, and I feel like 2014 is that catalyst year too. Not only, the LCS is in its second year there, and I think League of Legends starts to kind of take off more aggressively. But also the DreamHack Counter-Strike major that year, the winter one, was the one I think that really kind of was just like, okay, we're here. Like the viewership record was broken, I'm almost certain, at that event, if memory serves me correct. And it was like very clear, I think, that those two games in particular, League of Legends and Counter-Strike, were like the drivers of this industry at that very specific time. And they still are today, to be honest. So I want to talk about what changed over those 3 years, because I think 2014, 2015, and 2016 for esports are really crucial. There's a ton of investment coming on the team side. That 2015 or end of 2015 time period is when we see people that are from the Sacramento Kings invest, and they start Energy Esports, which is still around today. That is around the same time Rick Fox and his group start Echo Fox, and that's right there. And then Immortals as well, which is sort of venture capital backed and has some involvement from the Memphis Grizzlies. On the commercial side of things, on the broadcast side of things, we get the announcement of E-League, which I think changed Counter-Strike very significantly, in, I think, positive ways from the broadcast perspective, and maybe negative ways from the financial perspective, because the expectation got so much bigger, and because obviously Turner has a lot of money. And everything started changing then. E-League launches that following year in the spring, in early 2016. The LCS is ripe now with real billionaires kind of at the helm, and high level millionaires at the helm. We're not playing with daddy's money anymore in some cases. And so I want to talk about that period and how you saw things start to change. Let's both financially and also in the quality of the product.
So yeah, that was a very interesting time. I think there's probably a timeline we can draw looking at traditional television and traditional sports. I think if we start with, well, I guess they're hand in hand essentially. But if we start on the sports side of things, we saw individuals. I think it's quite obvious that at that stage in those years, especially before E-League kicked off, I think the investment could be from more of an individual than, say, a company for a team. I think things are a lot more expensive now. Maybe too expensive, one could argue, depending on what you're measuring. But from a sports perspective, one thing which is clear is that traditional sports have aging viewerships, which even includes professional wrestling. Actually, people, they're not living around their television anymore. So one question for them, and this is maybe skipping forward a few years, is how they get the next generation of people. And then like, well, what are all these people doing? They're playing video games and watching esports, and that's where you start to see, I think, the trickles of the big investments come through. Starting with people like Rick Fox, moving over to people like the organizations like the Dallas Cowboys, for example, who are picking up Complexity and so on. So I think, that certainly helped esports as well. It's helped and hindered in two different ways. It's helped because it's put a lot of money into the scene, and it's allowed it's allowed us to see what a proper organization looks like. Like I don't know if you've been to the Complexity HQ and the facilities and the support they have there. It's pretty interesting. But also, of course, that drove up the prices of salaries. But I think E-League's approach was quite a big one. Maybe the biggest one we've seen from a non-endemic organization in the space, because we've seen like Evos on ESPN, but that's just one thing, like a one-off event here and there. They put us in some pretty premium spaces. And again, like TV are losing the audiences as well, because people are watching on different devices. And we could see with the E-League implementation that it was important for them to get the TV viewership with the initial formats. Some people weren't so happy about them, like, oh, we can't watch the full show on Twitch, etc. But the whole point of the whole thing existing is for television. So that was an exciting time. I think for something like E-League, there was certainly some hostility from some of the larger orgs in the space who might not be working with them, and I can understand that, because a lot of people have put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into esports, and some orgs are a big reason why it really exists on any reasonable scale. So I can understand those feelings, but I think they did show us. We've had a lot of years in esports where if you're on production, it's Phil. It's like, right, we're going to throw to break in 30 seconds, 20 seconds later, Phil, etc. And, you know, that's fair enough. Like, but I think we've got past that for the most part. Again, it's not perfect. You're always going to have a PC crash and so on. But I think the great example that the big products of E-League left us with is how to run a slick and engaging broadcast versus what we had at the time, where you had these long panels that weren't so interesting and so on. For an esports broadcast to be not much more than programming of matches as opposed to a show. And I think E-League was an actual show with the segments they had, with what they did with the players off-site and how they introduced those videos and so on.
Yep.
E-League was a show, and I think we need more shows in esports. So that's like one of the more important things I think we learned from that.
Well, they're also the best, as an American basketball fan, they are also the best basketball broadcaster in America. They have less rights than ESPN, but do a better job than ESPN. It's from a storytelling perspective, have better commentary, analysis, etc. So I think they, and it's humorous. I think that was the difference. And I, you know, like obviously the E-League studio, for those unfamiliar in the space or watching this video, the E-League space was neighbors with the NBA on TNT space. And it's, you could definitely tell, you know, the NBA on TNT broadcast is really lively. You know, they've got like a fantastic set of people, Kenny Smith and Shaquille O'Neal and Charles Barkley, who play off of each other really well. And it is different. And I think that I remember at the time being at some of those events that you could tell they were trying to build some of the same sort of humor dynamic between all the different Counter-Strike broadcasters, you know, whether it be Thorin or Richard Lewis or some of the others that were there. And like, you know, live or like focus a little bit less on the game, have some fun with yourselves, right? Like, and I think that was something that they did really uniquely. Taking a quick break from this episode to have a word from our sponsors. The journey of my career has been pretty fast-paced. I started writing at 17, and within 16 months, I went from having never written a published article to landing a job at ESPN as their youngest talent hire ever. With that fast-paced career, I've often found myself struggling with imposter syndrome and with work-related anxiety. But over the past few years, seeing a therapist really helped me guide my way. And if you think you may be feeling depressed, stressed, anxious, and overwhelmed, then today's sponsor, BetterHelp, is here to help you. BetterHelp offers licensed therapists who are trained to listen and help you. Talk to your therapist in a private online environment whenever's convenient for you. And if you're like me, where it seems there's never enough time in the day, you understand how important that convenience is. There's a broad range of expertise in BetterHelp's 20,000 plus therapist network that gives you access to help that may not be available in your area. Finding a therapist can be hard, but BetterHelp simplifies that experience. You start by filling out a questionnaire to assess your specific needs, and within 48 hours, BetterHelp will match you with a therapist. From there, it's easy. Schedule video and phone sessions, message your therapist as much as you want, whenever you need to, and everything you share is completely confidential. You can request a new therapist at no additional charge anytime. I've been seeing my therapist Diane for 4 years now, and when we reflect back on the progress I've made in my life for the better, it's a pleasant reminder of why I started seeking help and the goals I had when we first started working together. Join the 3 million plus people who've taken charge of their mental health with an experienced BetterHelp therapist. Get your 10% off your first month at betterhelp.com/visionaries. That's betterhelp.com/visionaries. I want to ask you about, given the fact that you were running broadcast and helping produce a broadcast for a competitor, right, with Face It, but also kind of having a lot of different connections to the other people that were running tournaments in the time or in the space at the time, especially in Counter-Strike, like ESL. How did that put more pressure on you all to change what you were doing?
I think things got more and more competitive over time. And a lot of these pressures, take place above my head. But I think an example of that is perception is quite important. Which is something I've certainly learned. It's not always important in the right way, but it is what it is. So I think one of the most important things, or the biggest pressures, I won't say important things, but one of the biggest pressures was to have the most premium product, because when you're competing for sponsors, especially things have evolved to some degree. I don't know how far exactly. Like you look at let's say you make accessories for PCs, mice, keyboards, headsets, and so on. And in Europe, each of those countries has their own budget, and they're going to be small budgets versus North America. Let's say North America has one big booty budget, loads of money, and that's the person you want to make the partnership with. If you have to go to when you go over to Europe, you've got Italy's got their own budget, Spain's got their own budget, the UK's got their own budget, and for many years in the space, there isn't really a synchronization between those different areas. So it's pretty rough. And then when you add that you might have two different entities who are all trying to schedule over each other and more, that is quite high pressure. So they want the best representation of their product. Like who's going to make their product look the best, who is the most attractive, and part of that might be who's got the best studio, who's got the fanciest this or that. Like, well, I guess we're still figuring things out at that time. So there was one season where I think it was our first season of ECS was in the studios where they do the broadcast for Premiership soccer or football if you're in Europe. So we had one of their studios. It was this big studio in like a state-of-the-art facility where all the Premiership stuff is done near Heathrow Airport, which was pretty crazy. Catering was great though, but also very expensive. So I think again you're still figuring out what makes the most sense, but you want to get the most premium product, and that is an example of the pressures of that. Do we have to get this big fancy pants studio, and do we need like an epic desk like you might see on a premium news desk or something, with the screen in it and all this kind of stuff? And that stuff costs a hell of a lot of money. So there's a lot of pressures like that. There's pressures to get the right part of the calendar. You might be competing for live venues in different countries as well, or you might inquire. Maybe let's say you put feelers out in 5 different venues, and some of them are going to be in common spaces. London might be one of them. You might speak to a venue guy who says, "Oh, we've actually heard about a similar event," and you're like, "Oh God!" Like the paranoia sets in. So there's a lot happening in a very short space of time with all these different variables, and then you've got people want to like have the whole scene for themselves and so on, and just like you've got people who are maybe trying to get the teams to play only like exclusively over here and there and so on. So there's a lot of stuff that's happening all at the same time, which means that no one's getting any sleep, and all these problems are being solved by people above me. For the most part, my job is to deliver on camera while this is happening, but this is before we move to North America as well. So it might be broadcasting until 6 o'clock in the morning or something for the European games and the NA games to follow and so on. So there's a lot of stuff. A lot of hard work required. Not all fun and games. Definitely difficult times behind the scenes to make all of this happen. And that's true for multiple organizers as well.
Yeah, for sure. We saw in the kind of the period after we were just discussing in 2017, the Atlanta Major broke a viewing record, peaked over 1 million concurrent viewers on Twitch. Massive. Charles wins a huge event, and then it was usurped the following year by the 2018 Spring Major in Boston. And we've continually seen CSGO pack out arenas and also, continually break viewing records for live Counter-Strike events online. But I can't help but feel, even to this day, that the economics of Counter-Strike are not profitable, nor are they in most esports, to be clear. League of Legends has this problem too. And I want to ask you if there was a moment that you felt like the industry got ahead of itself in terms of being able to create something that could be sustainable and wasn't just continually bleeding money.
That is an interesting question. I think a lot of the recent years, I think a lot of the story in terms of my generation and so on, a lot of people have been competing with each other. You've seen Again, multiple attempts at like exclusivity and so on. And part of that is necessity for everybody to eat, you know. Did it get ahead of itself? I don't know if that's the right way to put it. So I think, well, in some ways, yes, actually. I think that the one way things got too far ahead is like the salaries that some people were being paid were unsustainable. And you know, when you've got lots of VC coming in, then you can, like, if you've got way more venture capital money being injected into your company, maybe you can just like ride it out until some other people can't keep up. But that depends. Like if you're a player organization, you're going to need pivots after more, you know, maybe you're saying, okay, after 3 years we're going to see where we are and so on, and then you've got a plan to tell your investors once you get to 3 years, okay, we're pivoting in these directions and so on. Once you have to like report the results, right, you need to have a plan B after that. So I think in terms of the spend in things like that, I think people have got ahead of themselves. I think right now things are revolving in a positive way, where we're seeing more examples of, like, if you look at players, for example, a lot of players in the past haven't really, you know, they've been paid loads of money and haven't really cared about anything else, making a profile or anything like that. I think that's partly hubris on their side, partly being young, partly not being educated properly or having proper requirements from the organizers above. I think things are getting more professional in that sense. I think partly you got to give credit to G2 for showing people how it's done in that respect. They're really I think they're setting a great example. It's entertaining as well, but people are really understanding how to build a fan base. We actually, for a number of years, we had, especially as if you look back to when TSM, for example, were in Counter-Strike, when they had players like Carrigan, some of the players who were on the classic Astralis team, you know, before it was Astralis, way back then, there was a long era where players were hopping from organization to organization to organization as things got more professional, as the salary people were getting was going up and up and up. And the problem I saw with that is, like, how do you monetize a fan base if the team is just hopping and changing their jersey all the time? It's hard to say in some other respects, because people are trying to, like, let's say event organizers are trying to establish something, and that's going to come at a cost. There needs to be a light at the end of the tunnel, though, you know, with respects to that. So some have gone for all out spend, big losses, you know, try to reduce them over time, especially when you're trying to sell, like you try and make the numbers look as lean as possible and so on. So there's different approaches. We always tried to do things in a way that wouldn't break our back. Yes, it is a struggle to stay in the black in esports, but I think it is getting better. But there are certainly some big challenges. People aren't, you know, buying tickets and not paying for television rights and so on. So those holes need to be filled. And that, I think that is the big question, basically, because we're always going to be comparing ourselves to traditional media and so on. I think it's strange that if you look at E-League as an example, right, they need to sell TV advertising for their product. They got a company like Arby's involved, and I think if you look at a game like CS as well, of course, you've got the guns, you've got the blood, etc., and it's not worth a lot of companies' time to kind of take risks like that, especially with how, you know, what happens with guns in America, for example. Arby's took a risk with that. They did it in an engaging way. They had advertisements where they were like blasting their burgers with guns and doing slow-mo stuff. Yeah, it was really fun, the kind of things they did. But I think if you look at traditional advertising, for example, you know, I think E-League's such a big entity. They're like an 8 billion turnover company. But let's say you look at an online broadcast they might have done. Maybe 30-40% of the online audience is from North America. But for me, I found it strange that, you know, you still have those metrics So I would imagine, and they're very, very targeted metrics. In terms of demographics, esports has the best demographic. It's got like 18 to 35 and even younger than that. So in terms of like new generations and so on, like we have such a solid demographic, the one that almost everybody wants, unless you're like a Rolex, for example. But for me, it's like a no-brainer. If you're a Snickers or something, because they had some lower thirds with some brief like Snickers before. I don't know why the TV advertising guys don't translate over to online advertising. Why they look at that weird when it's a more targeted audience than on TV and might do better numbers anyway. Because like one season of E-League, we replaced Big Bang Theory reruns on Friday, which still did great numbers, but I hate that show. I think it's not funny, so I'm glad we replaced it. But I don't know. I feel like for something like that, we might do better numbers online. So I don't know why the advertising doesn't translate and the advertising dollars as well, considering it's a super targeted audience and you have the demographics from like a YouTube, from like a Twitch, you know, male or female or other. Everything you want to know, you pretty much have, and I would say more accurately than say a Nielsen rating or something. So I think traditional media has got some catching up to do to reach our audience properly and not be stubborn and just hold on to TV. But that's how I see it. So to answer the question, yes, in some ways people will take too much risk, but that's, you have to dare to be great. But sometimes it'll be foolish. So yeah, it is what it is.
I think since 2018 in particular, we've seen a little bit of an audience shift where a lot of viewership, and granted, we still have really, really high viewership around like the key events in the esports calendar, all of esports, not just one game. The League of Legends World Championship does, 30 plus million eyeballs right across the world. The Counter-Strike majors and Cologne and Katowice are doing massive numbers also in their own right. But the regular sort of, week of a league is kind of mid, right? Like I tuned into the LCS this past weekend and they were doing 50,000 concurrent viewers on Twitch. I would imagine that's no higher than like 400,000 total in a broadcast over 8 hours. It's not great. And we saw in 2018 this massive shift towards personality-driven content, influencer content, right? The massive Ninja, Drake, Juju Smith-Schuster, Travis Scott moment that is that spring. And ever since then, it seems like influencers are sort of what's pushing the ball forward in the gaming industry from a live broadcasting perspective. They're getting massive platform deals. The esports tournaments aren't getting those anymore. We're not seeing the $90 million Twitch deal that happened with the Overwatch League much anymore. And and that was 2 years, 45 million a pop. Do you think that there is sort of a contraction around esports right in this current moment? And how do you think it's affecting everything around us?
I think the Overwatch thing was very inflated. I think the number was based on fear. Essentially, Twitch thinking like, okay, if we allow this to happen with YouTube, is this the start of the downfall where everything goes to YouTube and so on? So it's a big number. It's like a headline number, but it's like an auction. It's like a watch auction. You have some crazy numbers at auction, which may inflate the market somewhat, but not really give a realistic view of the day-to-day goings on. So I was concerned with some of the deliverables with that when you had brands as big as a Coca-Cola involved in the space, because you want that stuff to succeed to allow other people to follow in. So yeah, that was certainly inflated. So I don't think things should have been that high, but maybe it can be for the right game and the right execution. Perhaps it can be, but that was a very unproven scenario with that game. Not every game can be a massive esport, but on a larger scale, looking at league matches, it can vary depending on the game and how regular the games have played. Again, looking at the last 5 years of Counter-Strike, bearing in mind you had for many years, sometimes 3, sometimes even 4 different orgs running leagues or trying to run leagues and so on. The same teams are playing the same teams constantly. So if you have like an on season and off season, then I think you can have more desire, more the games can the individual like league games can be more engaging. I think it can feel like a chore for some, especially when you see them play each other all the time. Like, you know, if it's in a studio, if there's like no crowd or it's online or something, the desire might not be there like it used to. So I think that's a byproduct of competition as far as our game is concerned. And so there's a lot of variables. One is like if everyone's playing everyone all the time, what makes it special this time, right? Then another one is what are your metrics for success? Like is 50,000 regular concurrents enough? Does it need to be more than that? Is that perfectly healthy? Depends on what your metrics are. If you're promising 100,000 and you're getting 50,000, then obviously not. But if if you're getting enough impressions with your advertising and so on, and the drive is for call to actions, different types of engagements, like there are different measures for your deliverables depending on what your expectations are. So you can't just look at a number and say, okay, this is good, this is bad. Maybe if it's like 8,000 people, then let's start ringing the alarms because there's water coming in through the windows. So NFL, for example, they do some league matches in London now, and that way you firstly you massively expand your fan base, but also you can do live activations around those events as well. So for example, that's one way to do it, and that's something that Overwatch essentially wanted to do with their traveling games and different homestands and so on. It's like live activation. So a lot of stuff is live activations. If you can insert those in there somehow, let's say a football team owns an esports team, and like a few of them have or do. If you have a partnership with them where you can do a live activation, I don't know, depending on the time. Let's say you've got a football match, like a Champions League match would often be like 7:45 or 8:45 European time in the evening. If you had, I don't know, an esports game at 3 or 4 p.m, so people are in the venue early, you've got it on the screens or something, like metrics like that can make more of a difference than a league match. So there's different ways to measure things, really. So you can't just look at one thing. It depends on the goals that particular broadcast has and how they look to go about them.
I think we were sold, all of us, during this period of time in 2020, the beginning of COVID, all the traditional sports shut down, right? Like it was a super hazardous environment, right? Like we saw Rudy Gobert, the basketball player, essentially like cough on his hands and rub his hands all over microphones, and then it turned out he had COVID, and then he gave a bunch of other people in the room COVID, and we saw everything just like wind down that March/April, and esports was able to keep going because so much of what we do is online as a community, or could be done online. Obviously not as good if it is on LAN. You reduce lag times, it's easier to broadcast, etc. But at least we had the ability to do it. We didn't require studios for everything. And I think at the time I was working at ESPN, and we were kind of told internally, like, oh, this is your moment. And then we found ourselves 7 months later laid off, which is sort of a big whiplash from the narrative internally. And I think that I was getting at the time these, like, pardon my French, bullshit artist data reports about how esports is going to be like the next big thing. It was taking over because sports are on pause. And here we are 2 years later, and it's hard to quantify, but it just feels like the hype has kind of been pulled out of the room just a little bit. Do you feel that at all?
I think we're still rebuilding at the moment. And yeah, the next big thing is, it depends on how they, I mean, obviously, a lot of those, as you said, a lot of those articles are bullshit. It depends on how you qualify the next big thing. Is the next big thing what the mainstream people are doing? Is it Kim Kardashian playing Smash Bros at Evo or something? Like, what is, people I wouldn't say, I mean, gaming's certainly not niche. Esports, though, again, some are more watchable than others. I think when you've got something like COVID, I think one thing that was clear is that everybody can just fall back into their houses and do things like gaming and so on. But yeah, it has been quite a weird few years, definitely unprecedented, and I think things are certainly not normal yet. You know, we still have all the events that are happening now have got COVID protocols. I think at this point we're in a transitional period. That much is clear. There's been events, even like at the beginning of this year, for example, there were events which were planned for London, and then London, well, the United Kingdom or England, actually Scotland's got their own thing going on. So England still had like reactionary policies to COVID. So if you're trying to do events at the moment, things are still very problematic. For example, let's say we wanted to do an event in Canada right now. If you're a Canadian resident, you can come and go pretty relaxed. But if you're not Canadian and you go to Canada, you're still very subject to quite serious COVID protocols. It's basically a non-starter. Like at the moment, trying to do an esports event in Canada is not even worth looking into. You know, like a I'm not talking some studio event, like something big with a crowd. Not worth doing at the moment. If you look at Japan, which is a big region for certain games, Apex Legends being an example, I think until recently you couldn't enter the country unless you had a business visa. That might still be the case. So we are still in a scenario where we've got a lot of problems. And yes, we have run some successful events, like the Antwerp Major was fantastic. We had an enormous crowd there. That was one. You know, I've as someone who needs to travel and talk for a living and has severe asthma, I think one of the blessings of my job is that I'm often in studios. I'm not exposed to that many people, so my risk is relatively small versus someone who's like commuting to an office or a store to work every day, who's going to be exposed to way more people. But I did go out and be amongst the fans there, and then came home with coronavirus. So, and then I couldn't talk for like 3 weeks. I couldn't talk properly at all. So you know, so the long and short of that is that we still have serious problems out there. Yeah, it's hurt, but I don't know. Essentially, I think maybe next year we can like measure the damage that COVID has done, and that's not just true for esports. That's true for like everything. Everything is. It feels like everything is on fire at the moment, and I'm not talking esports. I'm talking in the world. Like the energy rises that we have in the UK are absolutely bananas. Amongst other things, you know, there's lots of crazy stuff happening out there. So I think everyone's suffering from the effects of coronavirus. Staff shortages everywhere. Even short haul flights from the main airport in the UK are being cut. Lots of flights being cancelled because they don't have the staff for the bags and so on. So everything is hurting. I think in terms of measuring the impact in it, are things on a downward trend? I think there's still a giant asterisk of the pandemic, which is skewing things in that respect. So I think first we have to look at the damage done, and you know, who survived, who didn't, who's smaller than they were before, and then maybe I don't know how many years after that we can really look at, are things contracting.
You are a big fan of F1, I have gathered from your tweets. And one thing that I think Formula One has done quite successfully for itself is that it has, with Drive to Survive in particular, it has made storytelling focus less on the race and more on the people in a way that I think is really, really unique to its sport. The Drive to Survive series is very driven by personalities and is driven by these drivers and the lives that they live and how they prep for what they do and the personality outside of that. We've seen a little bit of that in esports, but it feels like we haven't seen enough. We're still very, very hyper focused on the game, and you were talking about this a little bit. And we've seen some of the more successful Counter-Strike players in particular go on to be commentators, the people who are a little bit more personality driven. And when I say that, I think of Sponge and some of the others who are kind of in that category, right? What do you think the disconnect is there? How do you think we get more storytelling content in esports that makes it interesting to follow people from a personality perspective and less from they're good at Counter-Strike or they're good at League of Legends?
I think that comes in. I think it comes from different directions. I was going to say in different ways, but different directions. Part of that is the people putting broadcasts on And again, it's something. I mean, I think we've all been guilty of it for different reasons. The stuff we're seeing at the moment is still very formulaic. Get a player to sit down and be a talking head. Oh, we're gonna do our best to win, but if we hit our shots, blah blah blah, all that classic crap. We're still not seeing much in terms of personality. And hey, sometimes the players don't have personality, and that's not an insult. Like, if you think sometimes a player might be 15, 16, 17 years old, they've got a lot of talent, they're just no lifing a game, they get picked up by a professional team and they're traveling nonstop. They don't really have much opportunity to develop as a person or have necessarily the social interactions outside of their team and so on, which maybe can be done with some mentorship on that side. On the broadcast side, I think things are still very basic, and I think in most places kind of crap. I just don't think that there's enough people who are doing this stuff. Like, you can just look at people, see what they're interested in, and then just ask them about that instead of the same boring stuff about the team they played last week in a different country. Now they're in this country, and here's this dry content. There's like so much stuff you can do, but just no one's bothering to do it. And some, to some degree, like some talent have, like at different orgs where they're freelancing, have tried to engage the organizer and say, hey, let's do this. Like, we can do these ideas and so on, but they're not really either they're not being compensated for their efforts, or they're just not doing it. They've just got like a producer who doesn't care or doesn't have the time. I think it needs to come from a higher level above a producer that say, okay, we need to have this kind of show, and it needs to be scheduled properly and so on. So there's a lot of different ways that a lot of content can come through, and at least in the spaces that I'm in, doesn't happen in CS it doesn't happen at the moment. I think for Apex it's still very early, but those guys are very switched on and very things are evolving there every time we do something. But CS has got enough resources, and there's way more engaging stuff that we could certainly be doing to make things more of a show and less programming of matches and pages about stats.
Yeah, totally agree. That's what I'm doing. You just made my company pitch for me in terms of creating storytelling content that is storytelling content that goes further than just the game and focus on the people. Because like any industry, esports obviously has some very, very interesting people in this space that have life experiences more than just being very good at a video game. So thank you, James. So we got a couple different audience questions. I don't believe Scott's in the space anymore, but asked earlier, Scott Robertson, who's a Counter-Strike and Valorant reporter at Esports. He said, James, how involved are you still in FACEIT following the Savvy Gaming Group acquisition? And were you surprised to see DDK take the 100 Thieves Valorant GM job?
So right now, I think, it takes a long time for things to happen once a merger is complete on paper. Like you need to look at, let's say sales teams, for example. You look at a sales team on the FACEIT side, look at a sales team on the ESL side and see, okay, how do we make this one sales team for ESL FACEIT group? How do we understand each other's products? And how do we place things so we don't step on each other's toes, but we work together and find synergy and so on. And you need to do that for all different kind of departments. That starts with like legal, HR, all these kind of things. The back end programs get merged together into one, stuff like this. So it's a very slow process. So nothing has like changed at present. Hopefully it means I can actually commentate some Counter-Strike now. Still waiting to hear on that, but we'll see. I'm sitting and waiting to see what happens. Was I surprised to see? I knew about it before you guys did, but I think I think with the statements that he and Sean put out with the commentary and so on, I think that had to have already been secured before they did that. It's pretty cool. I think it's a good challenge for Dan. I think he needs some stuff that's outside of his comfort zone to have like contrast. The duo with him and Sean, I think, is very, very important to synergize together. So I think that is quite key. But he's very analytical, Dan. He's very his creative juices are all about analyzing stuff. So I think that will certainly help in that position. But I think the challenge is great for them.
I want to follow up something on this savvy question, and then Prime from my team wanted to ask you something about watches and fashion. So I'll let him do that because I know he's very interested in your fashion life. But we've seen a really, I think understandably so, massive backlash against the Saudi Arabian government in the gaming space when Neom announced partnerships in 2020 with Blast and with Riot Games around the LEC. There was a ton of backlash for a couple different reasons. The Saudi Arabian government is well documented to be very treat LGBTQ people very, very poorly, and that's very well documented, as well as Neon being built on indigenous land, which is a whole other issue of genocide in itself. We've seen since the acquisition announced of Faceit and ESL, a lot of backlash from your peers as well, publicly. How have you handled that? And I guess the other question is, do you rationalize who's now in charge?
Okay, so I mean, it's completely understandable people's issues with the, with that stuff. Completely understandable. If you haven't seen the Dissident movie, worth a watch. It's quite eye opening. So very very aware of that stuff. Obviously, don't support. Excuse me, things like that. So I think one of the concerns people have is whitewashing, like, when someone gets a big sporting event like a World Cup and they try and use that to better the reputation or the spottier things on their resume that they may have done before. I think I would like to think that this is more of a business. I know that acquisition. I know that they want to diversify away from completely relying on oil because that won't always be there. So I think for me, it's I think there's a focus on the things it enables us to do and the good we can do in a space, which is important. We aren't the government and can't change what they do. So I think what we can focus on is what we are enabled to do. And of course, I know there's been some events which were announced, I think in the UAE, for example, and then, obviously were very controversial, especially for some of the people in the space who in a normal vacuum may be expected to travel to places that would essentially be hostile for them. I think and obviously that's extremely uncomfortable for them, people who are fans of them and people who, fans of like just equality and not oppressing different types of people. I think what's also difficult is if you're a gamer from a country like that, if you go back to what I mentioned earlier about, like at the very beginning, about the people in Europe who were not getting a light shone on them because we didn't have any broadcasting and so on. I think one of the things that I want to focus on is, well, one of the things I would like us as a big entity to be able to do is provide at least more national opportunities for the people in those different countries. I think we're in a very unique position where the acquisition allows us to do things on a scale that wasn't possible before. Obviously, there's a big injection so we can do better shows and so on. But like for me, I think we can create infrastructure in various because there's a big gaming scene in the Middle East, and that's something that we can definitely support and give a national infrastructure to, which maybe doesn't exist on a significant level.
Yeah, to be clear, just from the question I asked too, I clearly the average citizen in the Middle East and Northern Africa deserves as much opportunity as anyone else. I think the biggest thing is just balancing that against a government that's or governments that have shown that they are okay with things that most of the rest of the world are not. And
Yeah.
so that's where my question was coming from. So we'll end out with Prame's last question, who I believe is hosting the space, about fashion, because you're a very fashionable person and now recently a Gucci ambassador. And I noticed, I believe those are Gucci glasses also on your face. So I recognize the stripe. So Prame, go ahead with your question, and then we'll call it a close.
Hey, James, huge fan. For one, I think you are quite literally the most fashionable guy in esports. And so I have to ask, what do you think of kind of some of the trends of fashion and presentability in esports, with kind of a focus on like the streetwear and tech wear versus the more traditional kind of fashionable wear?
Okay, thank you for your question. I appreciate your comments about the fashion. It's a bit rough in esports, I would say, at the moment, because a lot of places are a free for all, and that can be a hot mess. There isn't really coordination. I think you can wear anything. It depends on the level of the event. I quite like tech wear, but I feel like you can wear anything. It just needs to make sense. Fashion stuff, especially like tech wear, fashion wear, streetwear, is a culture. Like all these shoes behind me are a culture that everybody is into in a space. And again, in terms of having a show or something, this is something I've mentioned. I'm not going to go into it too much because, you know, if you tell people about your ideas and you can watch other people make them, but there's a lot of stuff that is unexplored with the culture that we have around the games, like streetwear, like watches, from $10 watches to what's on a top player's wrist that's maybe 10,000 plus, all kinds of stuff. So yeah, there's certainly space for everything. I think it can vary depending on your game. It can vary depending on, are you in a studio, are you in a live audience, are you a roving reporter, are you like next to the popcorn stand, or are you on the stage? You know, there's space for everything, but I won't have anybody, especially in Counter-Strike, say that this person is has the best suits or anything when you come to me and I'm wearing velvet. Yeah, don't. I'm not having any of that nonsense. Like, don't lie to yourselves. I'm the boss.